Hi everyone, it is Status Teenage. Welcome to or welcome back. We're your co-hosts Olivia
and Sofia.
And today is going to be a little bit more of a serious topic, actually a lot more serious, because today is the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation.
As the day we are recording this. This will come out on Sunday, which means we will miss it a little bit. But the important thing is that it's being talked about.
It needs to be talked about. So,
yeah.
To give a basis behind what this day is about...
Wait, can I give a little, pre-thing first?
Yeah.
Before we say anything, guys, this is, neither of us are Indigenous. If you want the real story, you should go talk to Indigenous people, go do your own research, and I don't mean that in a Republican way. I mean that in a educate yourself way. This is an important topic, and it needs to be heard by the people who are actually affected by it, rather than us. Obviously, we want to do what we can to spread awareness, but we are not the people you should be coming to for, first sources. We just hope that us talking about it will help you either, one, become more interested and become more invested in it, or two, if you are Indigenous, I hope we allow you to feel a bit more heard. If we come off as talking over you in any way, that is not our intention, but we are here to help, and we hope that we can do what we can, and you should go out and do more research on your own.
I also do want to say that I hope that we use the correct terminology when talking about anything. If we did not say the correct terminology, please correct us for future reference. So don't be afraid to tell us that a term is offensive. We will apologize and we will fix it for the future, because we don't want to be offensive at all.
As much as this podcast is for fun, silly things, as well as slightly more serious things, but still lighthearted from a teenager's point of view, we do recognize that there are a lot of issues in this world, and they can't be brushed over. And if we want to make a change, even though we're teenagers, there is something we can do.
We are the next generation, if you think about it. We really are the next generation to make change. And although the adults have started it for us, we should continue it. We should continue talking about it. We should talk about it every single year. Never forget about it.
Not just that. We should just talk about it today. We should talk about it as much as we can. Obviously, don't run into the street and start, but keep it in your mind when you're walking around in either Canada, the United States, anywhere that has been once populated by Indigenous people and has now been colonized. Recognize that this is not your land, bestie.
Yeah, the land you stand on was not your land. It is not anybody's land but the Indigenous. We're going to be talking from the Canadian point of view because in school...
We are Canadian?
We are Canadian, yeah. And in school and the media that we're exposed to, it's from the Canadian perspective. So I hope that we're correct about everything we try to share. We're not trying to, give misinformation. But, yeah.
We were lucky enough that we are able to learn about it in school. I mean, our parents and a lot of our teachers didn't learn about it until university, because our government, the government of Canada, wanted to cover it up, which is completely wrong.
You should definitely...
It's good that we are able to learn about it in school now.
You should definitely own up to what you've done, because I know that a lot of people view Canada as this amazing country, but we have our faults as well, whether that's the Japanese concentration camp, or that's the residential schools, or the Chinese workers. There is so much that Canada has done wrong, and I hate to I hate that people think that Canada is just this, like, amazing country. Like, you have to think about it. No country is perfect. Canada was also one of those countries that was heavily influenced by the Christian religion, and I don't want to really bring religion into this, but that's the premise of
residential schools.
Yeah. So, I think we should talk about the history now, because although the history is very, very complex, I'm going to try to summarize it in a way that everybody can understand, because I still myself don't really understand it. But basically, the first residential school that opened up was in 1831. The person, or the man, the leader that thought of the idea of residential schools was John A. Macdonald. He was one of the prime ministers of Canada, and he basically thought that if we brought together, as they called Indigenous people back then, Indian, and I'm not using that term throughout the podcast episode, I'm just saying that's what they were called back then, but he used
it's prescribed. It still hasn't changed yet. I think they're going to change it, but that phrase, that term, is prescribed in our law. It has not been changed. Again, they're working to change it, but throughout this podcast, if we say it, we're referring to, like, the legal or a quote. We do not mean it in any derogatory way, because unfortunately, again, it's prescribed in our law.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it is going through changes, though.
I think they are too. So, he basically called all the Indigenous people back then. Indigenous people are also not one culture or race, to put it plainly. It's a very multicultural group of people. But anyway, he called these people savages, and he basically put people into residential schools.
I mean,
it was a prison. It was torturous.
Technically, it was but it was more a concentration camp.
Yeah. That's pretty much what it was. So he gathers up all of these people, and the people that were in these schools were children that were stripped from their families. Not only were they stripped of their families, they were stripped of their culture, their language, their beliefs, their traditions, their cultural style, their clothing, their cultural hairstyles. Everything was stripped from them, and they basically were put into these schools to be, what's the word, like, Christianized, or like
they were being assimilated, aka whitewashed, aka tortured into being more white. By the way, when I say concentration camp, I don't mean like Nazi concentration camps. I mean the literal definition of a concentration camp, which is a place where large numbers of people, especially political prisoners or members of persecuted minorities, are deliberately imprisoned in a relatively small area with inadequate facilities, sometimes provide forced labor or to await mass execution. Keyword is sometimes. The term is mostly associated with several hundred camps established in Nazi Germany, but again, it can also be, it's basically just an area where large amounts of minorities or political groups were imprisoned and not given the correct facility. So even though it's like sometimes it involved in forced labor and yeah. So I don't mean like Nazi Germany concentration camps. I mean that definition of concentration camps.
So there was an act called the Indian Act. It was enacted in 1876, which basically, well, it's now been amended or has since been amended, but it
we still use the phrase in our like the word Indian. As I said before, the word Indian is still prescribed in our law when talking about Indigenous people, which again is wrong. So this act has not been completely fixed, but it has since been revised.
So, yes. So, basically, this act was meant to allow the government to control basically every single aspect of Indigenous life, whether that was their so-called Indian status, their land, their resources, their wills, their education. There was so much more that they governed, and the entire point of this act was to just terminate everything that was absorbing the Indigenous people into, like, basically not being Christian. Like, they tried terminating every cultural, social, economic, and political aspect of the Indigenous people. And I wanted to bring up some quotes of some survivors.
We all know it's so easy to find what people like John and MacDonald said. It's so easy to find out what these politicians used to say. But there are more current voices that no one talks about. There are a lot of voices that have yet to be heard because our culture, even though we've come a long way, we still tend to lean towards white males as our point of history, because we're still very biased in that regard. So it's important to talk about other people who were more impacted and who don't have an ulterior motive besides telling the trauma they went through.
Yeah, so from Helen Cromarty, hopefully I pronounced that right, her quote is, she's a survivor of residential schools. Her quote is, "As a residential school survivor, there were things taken away from us that we can never, ever get back. Doesn't matter how hard you work at it. I worked hard to get my culture back, my language, and I still have to work at it. There are many missing things that I can never, ever get back, but having the government apologize and acknowledge the damage that has been done, I feel a little reprieve." Or reprieve, one of those words. I can't read. "I can live with it, and I think that's another step forward. Why not keep going? The path is there now. Follow it. I left home when I was 5 years old, so the family bonding that all of you get when you're a child in those formative years, I don't have that. But I somehow learned that. After having 5 children, I worked hard at bonding." They basically took these children from their homes at such a young age so they could grow up and be whitewashed. And they weren't growing up in their culture, so they couldn't learn anything about their culture.
I might be incorrect, but I believe the phrase was, "kill the Indian, save the child." If that was, I don't know if that was in the law or if Sir John A. MacDonald just said that. I should probably double check. But that was a prominent part of the beliefs at the time.
So, along with just these children, being thrown into these residential schools, the reason why it was so horrific was because of the abuses and the neglect and the torture that happened in these schools. For example, 1 in 5 students at the school was sexually abused. Sexually abused. These children were not only sexually abused, but they were physically abused. They were physically abused when they did things like spoke their Aboriginal language or their Indigenous language, and when they wet the bed, or when they would smile at somebody. If they did anything that was seeming provoking, I guess, they would abuse the child with whippings, or strappings, or beatings, or any other form of humiliation. They would starve these children, and there has literally been thousands of deaths. Thousands. And there's even more than that just have not been recorded. And I remember there was this uproar when I believe it was 150 students, like bodies, dug up at a residential school.
More recently.
It was obviously. More recently, yeah. And then there has been a lot more searching for these bodies because a lot of them were not documented, not reported. So nobody knows how many deaths there have been.
1,800. It's definitely, currently, the record is more than 1,800, but if we're to be believing the Indigenous people who went through these experiences as we should, it's probably a lot more. Probably a lot more than 1,800.
I want to tell you how recent this actually was. Like, it wasn't just like a whole century ago. The last residential school that closed was in 97. In 1997, the last residential school closed.
Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau, was still in power when the residential school was open. Like,
that's what, 24 years ago?
Our current prime minister father was the prime minister when a residential school was still open. So this is not, even if you think that was long ago, just looking at lineage, you can tell that it wasn't.
It really was. It was what, 24 years ago?
I can't do math.
I think it was 24 years ago, if my math is correct. But when people, I've heard the argument, or not even the argument, just the statement of, it's been so long, why do people care? And that's not only directed towards Indigenous, but it's directed towards even the Black community.
Your mom died when you were 5, why do you still care?
Yeah, so I want to bring up generational trauma.
Now.
I want to bring up generational trauma because it is a thing. A lot of people lost their language and lost their culture and have not bonded with their family simply because of the residential school. A lot of people are not connected with their culture the way that they should have been because of these residential schools. Even people who are generations down from family members who have been in these residential schools, they still suffer the consequences of these leaders' actions. They still suffer it. They still have to deal with the fact that, their family members were tortured, starved, and they know they're dead, but they know absolutely nothing about them because their deaths weren't documented. And even if they were documented, they don't know where to go to see their grave because they don't have a grave. Their grave is the same as the next student. They're all like piled together.
It's horrible. I mean, I don't know what else to say besides it's tragic. What can we do to help? Well, for one, we can talk about it. Again, as you can probably tell, me and Olivia are not the most educated on this topic. We are teenagers, as this podcast dictates, and while that doesn't mean that we should remain at the same knowledge as we are, know that we are coming from this at a place of not knowing everything yet. We are educating ourselves more as we go on. So some things you could do about this, because obviously it's horribly tragic, and we all want to help. I mean, if you don't want to help, I don't know what to tell you. You're probably racist. I'm not going to apologize for saying that. But if you, as you should, want to help, especially since this podcast is directed at teenagers, a lot of times when these large issues come up, including obviously Indigenous people, when it comes to struggles of Indigenous people, when it comes to struggles of even BLM or even like LGBTQ issues, a lot of times because we're teenagers, we feel like there's not much we can do because we can't vote a lot of the time. We're not of age to vote yet. We're not of age we don't have money to donate. Hell, we don't even have, a lot of time people won't even listen to us because we're teenagers and people they don't want to listen. So if you're an adult, there are a lot more things that you can do than we are talking about, or I'm going to tell you to do. But as teenagers, I know, at least for myself, and I'm sure this is true for Olivia too, it is difficult to figure out ways to help because as young people, we often feel like there isn't much we can do. But there is. One of those things is talking about it. I know it's difficult because, as I said before, a lot of people sometimes don't listen to teenagers. But even if you're talking amongst yourselves about it, it's very important. Educate yourselves. Again, don't use me and Olivia as a way of educating yourself, because let me tell you, we don't know. We're trying to educate ourselves at the same time. This is coming out of, we are not educated on this topic. We're not educated on a lot of the topics we talk about on this podcast, but especially this one, especially one of this gravity, we are not the ones you should be coming to for information. Who you should be going to, as I said at the beginning of this episode, is Indigenous people. Those are the people you should be listening to. Those are the people you should be educating yourselves from. And me and Olivia are also educating ourselves as we go. This episode was solely to bring awareness to this and not to, this was not a teaching experience, as you could probably tell by the fact that we are questioning our facts as we went through this episode. But it's still important. It still needs to be talked about. You can also, I know petitions, they are important. You should sign petitions. Don't sign a petition, think that you've cured humanity and that you're a savior. Obviously not. Sign petitions with the intention to do more. Call your MP. Call Parliament. Call whoever you can, whatever government official you can, to bring awareness to this topic, to bring awareness to tearing down statues of people who brought about residential schools, to bring about, or to call them to talk about not putting in the pipeline, or any number of other, Indigenous or otherwise. You should be calling your government officials, even if you're a teenager, to talk about these things. So again, I know as teenagers it's hard to feel like we're making a difference, but we are, and we can. And even if it's just educating ourselves, the education we get now, we will be able to implement it later on in our lives where we can make a greater change. So just because you're a teenager, don't think that it's an excuse to go around your life, to go through your teenage years uneducated. You have to learn about these things. They're important. And they can't be looked over.
What I find angering is the fact that for generations, nobody has, Canada has just thrown it away. Canada was like, it didn't happen. Non-existent. We don't want to come to terms with the fact that we tortured so many lives. We ruined so many families, and dare I go back to the generational trauma, that's not just behavior-wise. It's not just trauma from first-hand, let's say, okay? Trauma chemically changes your DNA. Biologically, it changes your DNA. And that trauma gets passed down to your offspring, and their offspring, and their offspring. Which is why generational trauma is it's something that needs to be talked about more, because I don't think people realize that generational trauma actually exists. Intergenerational trauma is a thing. I don't think people realize the severity of it, because people will deal with it today. People deal with, think about how I can't even put myself in, the Indigenous shoes, because I am not Indigenous, but to think about it from their perspective, knowing that your ancestors, or even their, grandparents, or their, aunts and uncles, they probably, went through that. And then they have to accept the fact that only recently Canada just started opening up about it. And only recently were they getting the awareness they deserve.
I remember being in school, and I think it was grade 4 or 5, and then being okay, we're finally starting to integrate into our education. We were in grade 4 or 5. This has been going on for a long time. These residential schools, as you could probably tell, are very
160 years of residential schools.
And
160.
for just being like integrated into education, at least high school, elementary school education, I'm gonna highball it and say 10 years. Not even that, because I don't want to do mental math.
I don't even remember when they started implementing it into
it was
our
like
curriculum.
4 or 5.
I don't even think
it's less than 10 years.
I don't even think I learned it in like 4th or 5th grade. Like, I think that I started learning about it in high school.
Well, they were starting to integrate it into the education system, and when we were in 4th, 5th, whether your teacher talked about it or not, that's on your teacher. But I think they started integrating it into the education when we were in 4th or 5th grade, which is less than 10 years.
Yeah.
I can't do math.
That's like 8 years.
The thing, I'm not Indigenous, so this may be out of place for me to say, but we shouldn't be coming at this from a place of pity. Because pity is for people who are weak. We pity people who are weak. And the Indigenous people are some of the most resilient groups of people on this planet. So to pity someone, at least in my opinion, is one of the most disrespectful things you can do. Whenever I see people only talking about this issue on Orange Shirt Day, or being like, oh my god, I had no idea that all these people died. I know the graves opened up a lot of people's eyes, but you can just tell when someone pities someone else.
Yeah.
We should not be pitying Indigenous people, because as I said before, pity is for weak people. And the Indigenous people are not weak. They are some of the strongest, most resilient people to go through all of that and still be here
in Canada.
They do not deserve our pity. They deserve our respect. They deserve our recognition, and they deserve a lot more than pity. They deserve reconciliation. They persevere through the hate of our government and our people. So to pity them is the most disrespectful thing, at least I think, again, correct me if I'm wrong, that you can do. Don't pity people who are strong. You pity people who have lost a battle. And who lost the battle not fighting. That's who you pity. Indigenous people did not just fight, but they did not lose because they are still fighting. As long as you are fighting, you do not lose. You pity people, 1, who do not fight, and 2, who have lost. And they have to do both in order for them to deserve pity. We do not pity Indigenous people because Indigenous people are strong. And pity is for people who are weak. Canada's a giant country. Okay, yeah. Look how most of Canada is not populated.
Mm-hmm. But it's majority of, well, I'm going to use none of it. Like, none of it, it's like all islands, and it's like all ice. So it's basically inhabitable.
But much of Canada is not populated. Yet, for some reason, well, I mean, we know the reason is all economic based, but that's a whole other topic. Whether the economy should intervene its way into human life, which my beliefs on that, I mean, I think you can determine from where I'm going with this, are not in the interest of the economy. Most of Canada is inhabited, is uninhabitable. There's no one living in it. Okay, I'm not gonna try to be fancy. Yet, for some reason, Canada decides that it wants to go right through and invade more land from Indigenous people. So you are trying to reconcile with these people, but still try to take over their land.
The pipeline.
It's so stupid.
And there's this pipeline.
I don't care about the money. I don't care about the economy. Because at some point, you cannot sacrifice people's well-being for something man-made. Because at the end of the day, humans are part of nature. Money is made up.
We gave value to paper, bro.
People in power tend to do this but we cannot put money over human lives. And even if you think it's a waste of money to take down statues of people who opened up residential schools and played a large role hurting Indigenous people, I don't care that it costs money. I doubt the Indigenous people care either. You imagine waking up and your neighbor has a statue of the man who killed your parents in front of their house. And you're like, oh my God, bestie, can you take that statue down? That person killed my parents. And they're like, no, I'm not going to take it down because that person saved my cat. Like,
yeah.
You might not have known that person killed my parents before you put the statue up, but now that you know, take it down. Like, it's not about money. Money should not be put over human decency and human well-being. I'm sorry, that's just not the way it works.
It's honestly greed at this point. Like,
it always is.
It's just, people will talk about, because for the non-Canadians, basically, we have statues, and there has been like,
as a lot of Americans do, of people who are large supporters of slavery.
Yeah, so we have statues of like leaders who are involved in completely for residential schools, and there has been a lot of uproar recently, and those statues have been torn down. Personally, you guys can disagree.
One of our major universities was named after someone who contributed in the creation of residential schools, and they are gladly changing the name.
Personally, when it comes to the whole, should we tear down these statues, should we keep these statues up, I personally think that we should tear them down. Because you've mentioned it before, Sophia, you're putting people on a pedestal.
I mentioned it in class.
Yeah, she's mentioned it before. I did not mention it on call. But basically, you're putting people up on a pedestal to honor them for like one or two things that they did that were, good for the economy or good for the country or for whatever. And then you completely are blindsided to every horrible and every inhumane aspect of their reign or their leadership or their term as prime minister or whatnot.
The phrase putting people up on a pedestal is there for a reason. The act of putting someone on a pedestal is you're looking up to that person. You are idolizing that person. And when you put someone on a statue, you are physically putting someone on a pedestal to be looked up to be idolized. And we should not be idolizing these people. We should be idolizing the survivors and putting them as statues because they are the ones who deserve to be idolized and deserve to be recognized, not some asshole who freaking created residential schools with the Catholic Church. I'm sorry. No, I'm not, actually. I'm not going to apologize. I'm not sorry.
I even said it today during class. I genuinely believe that Canada has realized what they've done wrong when they started to separate themselves from religion. But not even just the government. I think that people finally realize that what they've done is wrong because religion has now become more secular.
We are lucky enough to be part of classes that involve these conversations, that we are allowed to express our views. I know in the States this is a big issue, the whole thing where they're just like, I don't want to get into it, but we talk about the harm that our country has done, and we are extremely privileged to be able to talk about our views and express them. Because even though it might not seem like it, being able to talk in class is a big thing, because not only are you being educated by your teacher, but the people around you who do not know very much are also being educated with you. And it's kind of a beautiful thing if you think about it.
It's a good conversation to have. It's a needed conversation. It's something that needs to be implemented in every single school. I believe that our school actually has a course on it now. We have a course that deals with Indigenous literature. That's what I know.
I don't know if they are implementing it or if they've already implemented it.
I believe our school has like Aboriginal or Indigenous literature, like a whole course of study. Or I believe that's like in our religion class. I think so. But yeah, so we have a course.
We go to a Catholic school.
Yeah, we do.
Which is a huge thing, because to be able to talk about the residential schools and the harm that religion has done in a Catholic school, even within our school, a lot of teachers don't feel comfortable talking about the harm that the Catholic Church has done. So we are extremely privileged to be in some specific classes that allow us to express these views, despite being in a Catholic school, because there are classes even within our school that don't want to have these conversations.
It's better to educate us while we're young so we know for the future, because I know that everybody would, to put it plainly, like, if it wasn't talked about in school and, like, nobody really, like, looked at the news, we would basically be walking around with a blindfold, just, like,
this goes for everything, though.
No, yeah, of course, it goes for everything, but...
And that being said, even if you're not educated while you're young, that's not an excuse to go through life uneducated.
Mm-hmm. Do your part.
If you are older, you should still learn. And if there are any parents listening to this, if your children talk about these issues, don't brush over them as being irrational teenagers. And just because you think that your teenager is trying to be different or trying to be woke or whatever, you need to listen, because even though you might not like the idea of your teenager quote unquote talking down to you, even though they're not, or you might not like the idea of your child educating you, because I know a lot of time parents feel like that they should be smarter and know more than their teenager because they're older, or their child because they're older. You can learn a lot from your kids. So just because they're your child, don't brush over what they're saying, because these are important conversations to have. And if you are not allowing your child to talk to you about these issues, whether it be Indigenous issues, whether it be LGBT issues, whether it be African American issues, you have to allow these conversations, and you cannot brush over your teenagers. This is what makes us feel like we cannot make changes, because people in our own household do not want to have these conversations. But they need to happen, and just because you're older than your teenager or the people around you, or that doesn't mean that you are excused from educating yourself. That same goes for old people. If you're old, if you're like in your 60s, 70s, you still need to progress and learn. You can't just use "I'm old" as an excuse for bigotry, no matter what the conversation is, and it annoys the shit out of me when people do.
See, I talk about it a lot, and I not on the podcast, but I say it a lot. Like, every time I try to educate somebody around me who's older than me, I usually get shut down because, I'm young. They think I don't know what I'm talking about. And I've noticed recently that I tend to get jumbled with my words a lot, and I'm not really, like, in the right headspace a lot. But when I finally get what I'm trying to say across, it makes sense. And I feel like we need to get out of the stigma that teenagers are only supposed to learn from their parents, and their parents are not supposed to learn from their teenagers. Because how are you supposed to understand your teenager if you won't even listen to them or listen to their concerns? And you say you know your teenagers the best, or you know the people around you the best, but when they come to you about issues, or they want to educate you about something that you may not have even learned in school because you're, for example, the Indigenous residential schools. You probably didn't learn that growing up, and we're learning it, so we want to educate you. Don't brush that off. Do not turn it away.
We're not talking down on you. We are trying to help you. Or we might even not be trying to help you. We might be trying to get things off our chest that we need to talk about. So even if you don't want to look at it, even if you feel uncomfortable looking at it from my child's trying to teach me better view, look at it as my child's trying to express something that's bothering them view. And then maybe you'll be more open, and maybe you will be able to absorb some knowledge and grow from that as well.
open-mindedness is what is going to cause change. I definitely believe that if we talk about an issue, we're open-minded, we put in the effort to educate ourselves, and we make things priorities, things will change. There will be changes. There won't be just a national day for truth and reconciliation. There will be more that can be done. There will be more conversations about it other than, hey, wear your orange shirt on this day. There will be more that will happen. And to go back to the statues, the people you want to put on a pedestal, especially in Canada, would be like Terry Fox. Terry Fox has a statue. Why do you want Terry Fox and Johnny MacDonald to be on the same pedestal when they did two completely different things, one being good and one being absolutely disgusting?
Like, I get he was a prime minister, but
you're not going to have a statue for every single prime minister.
Hitler was also a leader of a country.
They don't have a statue for Hitler.
No, they don't.
Because Hitler was a bad person.
Anyways, I think it's time to end this episode. I know usually we end with a go check out our stuff, and you should, we're Status Teenage everywhere, but I think it's more important to say, try to change, you should educate yourself, you should talk about these issues, you should learn from Indigenous people, works, you should sign petitions, you should call your MPs, you should DM us if we've said anything incorrect.
Yeah.
It's easiest to reach us on Status Teenage on Instagram. We love reading what you have to say, even if and we especially appreciate constructive criticism for this episode. Unless you're being a bigot in the comments, then you're being blocked. And instead of shouting out our social media any more than I already have, I would like to, I know TikTok probably isn't the best place for information. However, I think it's important that we shout out some Indigenous TikTokers, like Sheena Nova, Modern Warrior, and Indigenous Baddie. So again, they may be TikTokers, but it's one place to start. It is not an Indigenous person's job to educate you. You are not special. You are not entitled to their time or energy. But if there are Indigenous works, you should read them. Mm-hmm. And you should educate yourself from the source, but don't go harassing Indigenous people and asking to learn. They do not owe you anything. They especially do not owe you anything. They don't even owe you the time, an introduction to their, they don't even owe you their name. So can we, don't, it's the same for any minority group. They don't owe you reasons why they feel this way. You do your own research, especially if it's from the source, but don't go out and harass the source, please. Anyways, guys, thanks for watching.
Thanks for listening. Yes, this was Status Teenage.
Again, we apologize if we have said anything that has crossed the line. Please let us know. And this comes out of a place of, yes, probably some misinformation, hopefully not some misinformation, but we are still learning, and we hope to learn more, and we hope to learn with you guys, and we hope that at the very least we brought some light to this issue and encouraged you to go do more searching yourself.
That's all from us. This was Status Teenage. We'll see you next week.
Don't die.
Stay vaccinated. Get vaccinated.